Good. Ralph, we're ready.
Yeah, great. Welcome, everybody. This is the third in the entire seminar series. So welcome to Huma's seminar series. Thanks to Divine Fu and the department. And my name is Ralph Borland. I'm a researcher here in the Ethics of Care strand at Huma, and I'm almost at the end of my first month here. We have this seminar this week is Rachel Adams, and Rachel Adams is a senior research specialist at the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa, and her work sits at the intersection of law, ethics, gender, and technology. And I met Rachel towards the end of last year in connection with a project called Global Narratives of AI, which is based at Cambridge University. And Rachel is one of the organizers of the South African series of conferences here, looking at the narratives around AI, how AI is imagined in different parts of the world. And I will be speaking at the workshop to be held in the next month or so on Afro and African futurisms. So Rachel's paper that was distributed before the seminar has the title, Can Artificial Intelligence Be Decolonized? And her paper engages with this question, particularly in the South African context. And yeah, I'd like to hear from Rachel. It really has a bearing on the ethics of care strand at Huma in particular, given that one of the subjects of the paper is ethics in AI. And I was really interested to hear just last week from Ryan Nefford, one of our faculty members, that there's a project at UCT to create an ethical AI. And he shared a paper with me about their project to create what they call artificial moral agents, AMAs. So AIs which have ethical or moral capabilities or characteristics. So Rachel in her paper, gives a good critical overview of the idea of ethics and where ethics come from and how those might intersect with artificial intelligence. So yeah, thank you very much, Rachel. And if you're ready, we'd love to hear from you. And after your presentation, we'll take questions and have a discussion of the paper.
Cool. Thank you so much, Ralph. And thank you to Divine and all the colleagues at Huma. I'm really excited to be part of this humanities-driven quest to explore artificial intelligence in all its kind of ramifications, and from a deeply African and diverse African perspective. So with that background, this talk today is about what it means to talk about decolonizing AI. And it was a term that I noticed was floating about, particularly in the West, a couple of years ago, and it's rise in popularity. And it arose at a time when decolonization was becoming a more politically charged word again, in different sectors and for different reasons. And I thought it necessary to take critically the injunction to decolonize AI, to think about what it meant and to think about what it meant to put these two words together. So Ralph, I think I'm going to be about 35 minutes. I'll try and go through this more quickly, and I'm really keen to have a good discussion and to hear other people's perspectives on this. I think there is so much more to say, so much more to explore. So I'm really interested in doing that collectively. So AI is structurally, somatically, and psychologically altering not only local and global society, but what it means to be human or to be counted as such. And the question of race is the question of the human and who and what constitutes the human. So to put this differently, if AI is changing what it means to be human, or is at least resurfacing these questions in new ways, this is inherently inseparable from the question of race and the forms and practices of power which instituted and formalized race, that is colonialism. And I want to say from the beginning that AI is many things that forge together into one master figure of contemporary society. It is an advanced technology which requires super levels of computer power. It is an industry, one of the most powerful and dominant in the world, and it is an imaginary of the future. Now, AI as a kind of sector is in the midst of reconciling three major so-called ethical discontents in their relation to the forms of coloniality and the historical construction of race that's still at work in the world today has yet to be fully understood. So the first is bias and how racial and gendered biases in particular are manifesting within AI technologies. The second has been broadly captured by Shoshana Zuboff in her major treatise on surveillance capitalism and relates to the ways in which AI and digital technologies are working globally to commoditize all everyday aspects of human experience. So within this data paradigm, the human is substituted as an assemblage of their data points, which are in turn taken as a sign of the real. The third discontent rests at a geopolitical level and pertains to the emergence of a new kind of arms race, characterized by the ambitions of transatlantic nation states to be, as Vladimir Putin puts it, global leaders in AI innovation. Here, new dependencies are being tacitly enforced between low-tech and advanced tech states, which are set to follow the historical divide of north-south, colonial, colonized. And the drive to dominate in the production and the use of AI is revealing of the project's hegemonic impulses and the scientific and technocratic idea of the linearity of the evolution of science and progress, which will leave behind those that do not conform to catching up. So I wonder, sorry, Ralph, I'm getting a funny background on my side. Maybe that's...
You just have your room. You just have your room behind you?
Yeah, no, sorry. I just wondered if there was somebody not on mute and we were hearing the
audio background. Let me see.
Yeah, but don't worry so much. So the foremost efforts to reconcile or resolve the discontents within AI have taken shape within discussions around and the evolution of ethical principles to govern the development and application of these technologies. And the overall agenda, which relates to what you spoke about in terms of artificial moral intelligence, but the overall agenda seems to be to create benevolent AI. The idea of decolonization seems to have emerged largely within this discourse in recognition of the racialized and imperialistic effects of the field's power. But to date, the idea of decolonization is being mobilized within the field in a way that broadly asks, what can decolonization mean for AI? That is, how can the critical ideas of decolonial thought be applied to and utilized to broaden and critique the field of AI? So instead, I want to explore what I argue to be a very necessary shift in perspective and ask instead, what does AI mean because of colonialism? Without thinking within the decolonial paradigm, which demands a critical positioning of AI amidst the historic totality of colonialism and race, we run the risk of reproducing the very problematics that decoloniality seeks to disrupt. So here I'm going to provide a quick exegesis on the notion of decoloniality and what it means in relation to AI, what it can mean, before offering a critique of some of AI's major aspects. So the ethics, which glosses its legitimacy, the valorization of intelligence, which the industry performs, and the colonial invention of statistical enumeration of people and land that AI appropriates. And the contribution I want to make is twofold. First, to articulate why it is not sufficient to simply identify the reproduction of racializing and colonialist logic in the science and practice of AI today. Rather, what decolonial thought demands is to show precisely how and why AI as a field depends on and was made possible by these logics. And second, I want to pose the question of whether a decolonial AI future that makes space for multiple and culturally varied accounts of intelligence and being human is indeed possible. Can AI really be decolonized? Or does its decolonization require its entire negation? So decolonization is a contested term. In its formal historical sense, decolonization refers to the process of transfer of legal, administrative, and territorial power from colonial hands to indigenous local governments and the establishment of modern nation states independent from European empires. And this took place in highly differential ways. So the experience of Haiti in the early 19th century differs to that of Ghana in the mid-20th century, and it is even more complex to speak about the decolonization of South Africa. Despite formal decolonization, the legacies of colonialism and the racial bifurcation that it was both built on and produced were not so readily dismantled. From the ashes of formal colonial rule, ulterior forms of imperialism arose, undermining the sovereignty of post-colonial states and peoples through economic and legal dependency and exploitation, epistemic authority, and a mixture of both humanitarian paternalism and abandonment. The enterprise of decoloniality seeks to identify, critique, and undo the ulterior forms of imperialism within global society that were instituted and made possible by the colonial project. So the idea of decoloniality has been refracted in various local contexts. In South America, largely led by the intellectual work of Annabel Quijano, Raymond Gross-Fugel, and Walter Di Mignolo, amongst others, coloniality names the Janus face of modernity and capitalism. Colonialism is the central force that makes possible the interlocked projects of modernity and capitalism. Thus, the end of modernity is, as Mignolo and Walsh put it, the ultimate decolonial horizon and requires, too, the end of capitalism as we know it. For Quijano, decoloniality constitutes the inverse force of coloniality and not, therefore, a form of deconstructive power that comes after colonialism. So in this sense, Quijano appears to draw from Foucauldian thought on power and resistance to conceive of decoloniality as the potentiality to undo and to invalidate that has always been and will always be caught up in the active presence of what he names the coloniality of power. The decolonial project therefore requires identifying the signifying practices of the coloniality of power, the epistemic, cultural, political, and economic apparatuses through which the oppression of subalterity is constituted and maintained, and Eurocentric and phallocentric ways of knowing, being, and thinking are reproduced as superior and singularly legitimate. Within decolonial thought from the African region, race is, as Sabella and Deluvo Gaccheni puts it, the chief organizing principle, the central figure within the entanglement of coloniality and being. Further, Shepo Madlingozi has articulated that the entrenchment of a world of apartness constitutes one of the major legacies of colonialism. Formalized in apartheid South Africa, this world of apartness continues globally through latent and overt systems and structures of racial and gendered bifurcation that mark, divide, categorize, classify, and hierarchize individuals according to social norms of undesirability. More broadly, the world of apartness is a product of the historic totality of race and racism. So Crane Sudin narrates the global history of race along three major historical arrangements. The first is its invention as a myth of European superiority, which peaked in the 17th century with the transatlantic slave trade. The second takes place over the 19th and early 20th centuries, where race entered scientific discourse and was legitimated as empirical knowledge with race science and projects such as eugenics. Critical to race science was the development of scientific discourses which sought to empiricize differential racial attributes, whether physiological, such as phenology, or cognitive, such as intelligence tests. In the third arrangement, from the 1930s onwards, race became recognized as a social and an ideological construct and race science was slowly discredited. Decoloniality can be located within this arrangement as the final arrangement of race, or an injunction for the final arrangement of race, as a radical anti-racism to come. Within the US, decolonization has at times been adopted as a strategy for naming and addressing broader issues of social justice concerning systemic and structural forms of racism, discrimination, and oppression. And this has been critiqued in a really wonderful article by Tak and Yang as abstracting decoloniality through its easy adoption as a metaphor for these social projects. They argue that this both detracts from the actual project of decolonization, which in the US would pertain to the repatriation of indigenous life and land, and re-performs the settler logic of appropriation. Indeed, to produce decoloniality as a metaphor is both to seize its epistemic strategy of resistance and to reduce it to rhetoric, to a figure of speech which, in the chain of signification of a metaphor, is further removed from the actuality which it seeks to describe and deconstruct. So, to use decolonization as a metaphor subverts its politics, neutralizes its potentiality, and recenters whiteness. Decoloniality is the strategy, a situated and responsive strategy to the particular form of power over that coloniality impressed upon the world, and not an autonomous and separable concept that can be put to work as a strategy for something other than that which it necessarily relates. Decoloniality must be revolutionary. Anything less, as Andaluvi Gatsheni avers, is reformism and just another way to seem progressive. So what does it mean to talk about decolonizing AI? Decoloniality requires a distributed effort across multiple planes of meaning to fracture both histories and futures which delimit the participation of colonized people and lands and forms in their global humanity of life. In relation to AI, this translates to a complex question that I'm only just beginning to explore. It demands a continually reflexive critique of the conditions of possibility for life and living now, then, and in the future that are being fixed and bounded by AI and its attendant discourses and practices. So the production of the world of apartness, Makangozi's term here, takes place through what I call here dividing practices. And I take the term from both Michel Foucault, who writes on the production of the objectivization of the subject and speaks of dividing practices which divide the subject from the norm and from others, as well as within itself. Writing at the same time, I also take from Edward Said's critique that he sets out in Orientalism of the dividing line that's discursively formed between the Occidental and the Oriental worlds, where the former paradoxically presupposes and depends on the latter. For both, power resides with those who can make the catechistic decision to divide. It is well noted how AI systems sort personal data according to socially ascribed normative markers. At times, these markers are directly racialized or gendered, such as systems that only allow women access to female changing rooms. Other times, these markers may be implicitly biased, such as targeting systems for advertising or policing based on postal codes. Such systems work by classifying, sorting, and ranking personal data through processes of data collection, curation, and annotation, using advanced statistical methods for modeling distribution and measuring correlation in order to calculate risk, predict behavior, and optimize the system's own functions. In these contexts, data assemblages constitute a representation of the individual that they're taken as a sign of the real. These statistical systems have their history in colonialism and were developed and appropriated within former colonies to control and divide colonized people and lands. Edward Said wrote that, rhetorically speaking, Orientalism is absolutely anatomical and enumerative. To use its vocabulary is to engage in the particularizing and dividing of things Oriental into manageable parts. It's always a form of management and governmentality. Similarly, in narrating the enumerative practices of colonialism in India, which he critiques as having both a disciplinary and pedagogical effect in delimiting colonial subjectivity and in training colonial administrators, Appadurai writes that the link between colonialism and Orientalism is most strongly reinforced at the loci of enumeration, where bodies are counted, homogenized, and bounded by their extent. Thus, the unruly body of the colonial subject, fasting, feasting, hook swinging, abluting, burning, and bleeding, is recuperated through the language of numbers that allows these very bodies to be brought back, now counted and accounted for the humdrum of projects on taxation, sanitation, education, warfare, and loyalty. Enumeration and the production of statistical knowledge in the colonies performs a number of functions, including entrenching and policing colonialist boundaries of colonizer and colonized and their derivatives, but also in enforcing divisions between colonial populations and as a form of remote colonial rule. On both a structural and an individual level, these colonial archives functioned as a kind of palimpsestic form of abstract representation that were taken as a token of radical realism, as Said puts it, a fixing of the ontology of the colonies and its people by Western knowledges, just as the data assemblages of today work to fix individuals by taking their data as a sign of the real. Writing of forms of representation at work within systems of racism, Mbembe speaks of a will to representation being at bottom a will to destruction, aiming to turn something violently into nothing. In this way, to constitute something in the form of something else, something more manageable and more malleable to forms of racializing power, consists of an essential and violent erasure of the original. Imperial knowledge practices based on abstract and racialized representations constituted not only a way of dividing the self from others and from itself, but worked to erase those who fell on the wrong side of the dividing line through substituting them with their representation. So comparably, Simon Gikandi chronicles the slave masters' fastidious record keeping of the behavior and the activities of their slaves, such as this constituted an archive of the evidence of the latter's objectification, as chattel, as property, and indeed as the symbol of the barbarianism that enabled white civilization and its modernist cravings. That Simone Brown now writes of data-driven surveillance systems being put to work to surveil and bound Black lives in particular as exacting the self, its body and its behavior, to testify as evidence against itself, holds a critical provenance within the history of the management of Blackness during slavery and colonialism. The effects of these systems, which include AI-enabled biometric technologies in airports and public spaces, and which Simone Brown describes as reifying structures of racial difference, is to produce an ontological insecurity. This is her terms, an ontological insecurity, an alienation within or a dividing practice of the racialized self. Some of the most advanced biometric systems in the world today utilize facial recognition technologies within their technological makeup. These technologies function by reading the signatures, the signs of human faces, such as the distance between facial features, and comparing the image to an expansive database of human faces in order to detect physiognomic patterns by which the machine then makes sense of the social status, the gender, the race, the age, the sexuality of the person whose face is being read. While these practices work to enforce social stratification and reinscribe racialized hierarchies, this repeats too the very logics of race and racism, to deduce from signs and from surface appearance who an individual is and what they can do and who they can be in this world. Race science legitimated this logic through the production of knowledges that sought to evidentiate the link between surface appearances, skin color, facial features, skull size, and inherent cognitive abilities and behavioral traits. Today, facial recognition technologies employ similar practices in measuring facial diameters and expressions as a means of inferring emotions and intent, predicting behavior, and even understanding levels of intelligence. But more critically, these systems provide the tools with which to allow for the return of race science under the guise of securitization, market efficiency, and risk management. So one of the fundamental areas in which I see a linkage between the history of colonialism and the practices of AI today is in the valorization of the idea of intelligence. And there's a paper from Francois Chalais that was published in 2019, and it begins with this epithet from Alfred Binet. And Alfred Binet was one of the pioneers of the early psychometric and intelligence tests. So this epigraph reads, "It seems to us that in intelligence there is a fundamental faculty, the alteration or the lack of which is of the utmost importance for practical life. This faculty is the faculty of adapting oneself to circumstances." So this is the opening ambit of Francis Chalot's paper that sets out how advances in AI systems can be assessed through a psychometric test, apt for measuring his revised and actionable definition of human-like intelligence. So his beginning premise is that there hasn't been a good enough definition of intelligence against which to measure the advancements of AI. So he posits that in order to advance development towards artificial general intelligence, the field must delineate a precise and measurable, always has to be measurable, notion of human intelligence against which to benchmark progress. And he posits the utilization of psychometric type tests that can measure abstraction and reasoning capabilities, in particular of AI systems. He says that these are key attributes, abstraction and reasoning, of intelligence. So the results of these tests can then be used to determine the optimal curricula that can be used then to improve and advance AI systems. So he writes that we posit that the existence of a human level abstraction and reasoning corpus solver would represent the ability to program an AI from demonstrations alone, requiring only a handful of demonstrations to specify a complex task, to do a wide range of human relatable tasks of a kind that would normally require human level, human-like fluid intelligence. As supporting evidence, we note that human performance on psychometric intelligence tests is predictive of success across all human cognitive tasks. So the optimum AI system displays the highest form of human-like or human-level intelligence in reasoning and abstraction, and is disposed to self-correct with minimal intervention and exposure to curricula. He asserts that human-like intelligence lies in broad or general purpose abilities and is marked by flexibility and adaptability. A fundamental notion in psychometrics is that intelligence tests evaluate broad cognitive abilities as opposed to task-specific skills. And Chalais offers a history, a very brief history of the concept of intelligence in European thought, but he doesn't define it as European thought, it's just general universal thought, through Aristotle, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And it's a paper that is already being highly regarded in the industry, but it stands as a disquieting testimony to AI's celebration of a decisively Western notion of intelligence. Like ethics, and I'm going to talk about ethics in a minute, intelligence is a value-laden concept which has been historically put to work as a racialized divide in practice to differentiate between peoples and reaffirm white superiority. So the Alfred Binet of Chalais' epigraph was the pioneer of psychometric and intelligence tests that were originally established, as Stephen Cave notes, to establish the notion of a mental age in order to determine which children were so behind that they should be given special education. And these tests were then used in the US and in British colonies and in South Africa to justify the idea that intelligence was a hereditary attribute largely endowed to the white race. So the legacy of the original Binet test in the various evolutions of psychometric and intelligence tests that followed was the use of such tests to supposedly determine not only the cognitive appropriate educational interventions for individuals, but their essential educatability. By the 1950s and the 1960s in South Africa, instruments testing educatability became used to test the adaptability of the natives to new working demands. So following the publication in 1943 of his book, African Intelligence, Simon Beshuvel led a proposal to develop a psychological assessment to, among other objectives, determine the extent to which the African's behavior is modifiable. In a piece by Leher and Cockcroft, they later note that this group of psychologists felt it was necessary to understand the African personality in order to justify the inferiority of Africans to other races and to control and modify African behavior. Despite this taking place well after eugenics had been dismissed from the global scene as an unethical science in practice, the hallmarks of the idea that individuals exposed to the right stimulus could be corrected and improved remained. Stepping remarkably close to the logics of eugenics, Chollet asserts that the emergence of human cognition is evolutionary. He asserts that human cognition was evolutionary, and on this basis advocates for AI systems to be developed in environments that are optimally designed to promote its effective advancement. One of the primary assumptions of the field that Chollet's paper seeks to contribute towards the development of is the idea that human intelligence and broader psychological functions and physiological functions can be anatomized and known in such detail that they can be replicated and simulated by a machine. In short, it presumes the total knowability of the human and their consciousness. And in this way, AI aligns with the fundamental premise of cybernetic and then eugenic reason that was appropriated by Beshuvel in the 1950s in South Africa, that with precise knowledge, coupled with exacting interventions, the human can be corrected, improved, and even, as AI claims to make possible, replicated. So decoloniality constitutes one of the kind of cutting edges of AI ethics, or at least AI ethics would like to think it does. So in 2019, a study was published in Nature, which identified over 84 ethical standards for the use and development of AI that have been developed globally in the last 5 years. And despite its title of being the global landscape of AI ethics, among these 84 AI ethics standards, none were from the African continent or even the global south. Most were developed in the US, the UK, or by international bodies. So Mohammed, Ping, and Isaac, in a piece they wrote on decoloniality as a socio-technical foresight that they published last year, note how national AI policies or strategies are almost exclusively found in the global north, and where efforts to develop a national policy around AI are rising in countries within the global south, this is being driven by super state bodies such as the World Economic Forum. And my personal experience can testify against this, but that's for another time. So as benchmarks for ethics, the standards that are being developed are paternalistically positioned as universal, applicable for all, everywhere. So in addition to the development of this quasi-universal standard for AI ethics, the scientific practice of promoting and advancing ethical AI through strengthening or testing the fairness of AI systems, so the extent to which they exhibit social biases in particular, performs a similar conceit in presuming that the scene of the global south, and more specifically the African region, to be a place where ethics as such is yet to be fully established. So in a now rather well-documented event that took place in 2018, when issues around racial bias and the non-recognition of Black faces by AI-driven technologies was central in public discourse on AI, there was a Chinese facial recognition company that signed a deal with the Zimbabwean government to access the records of the National Population Registry, which contained pictures of the faces of millions of Zimbabweans. This data was to be used as learning curricula to train the company's algorithmic technologies to better recognize Black faces. In reducing the potential for bias, the system would ultimately be more ethical. So Balim and Keith Breckenridge condemned this incident for exploiting the inadequate data protection provisions in Zimbabwean law. But it is more than that too, that it shows that different from practices, that practices that Mohammed and Ping and Isaac had talked about in their paper of beta testing newly developed AI systems in African countries, and they call this ethics dumping. And they cite an example where Cambridge Analytica had tested their algorithmic systems that they would then use in the US and the UK. They first tested them in Nigeria and Kenya. So this follows a kind of centuries-old colonial conceit of what Jan Smuts euphemistically called the laboratory of Africa, where the collateral damage of scientific advancement could be safely imbibed in places and by people considered expendable. And more pointed to the epistemological foundations of artificial intelligence, Francis Galton's work in the development of statistics, particularly in terms of inference, regression, correlation, and the normal distribution curve, arose out of his explorations and work in Southern Africa, where he tested his statistical science on native populations in order to measure human differences in intelligence. And Keith Breckenridge has done a lot of work in this area. So in the instances described above, the idea of ethics is situated as a value supreme of the Occidental world, to be proselytized on the African region, which in turn, and in relation to the ethical West, is positioned as pre-ethical. This is Mbembe's world, and therefore is a world apart. That Europe believed itself to be helping and protecting its African colonies constituted the central creed of the civilizing mission of colonialism, where, as Gayatri Spivak reminds us, ethics served and serves as its energetic and successful defense. Yet, as ethics was put to work to justify both the civilizing mission of colonialism and the utilization of Africa as a laboratory for Western scientific progress, it performed another conceit of the colonial order of things, that Western reason was neutral, universal, and objective, and could and should be dislocated from the context in which it arose and applied elsewhere. It was positioned as a point zero from which to survey the world. Western knowledge and rationality claimed an irrefutable ascendancy to offer the only real way of knowing and understanding the world. And this is the critical problematic named within decolonial thought, an essential assumption within AI too, that intelligence and the production of knowledge can be outsourced to a machine presupposes such knowledge to be both separable from the context in which it was produced and applicable to other contexts and realities. So, and I'm going to wrap up as quickly as I can, Ralph. Decoloniality is far more than a tool to problematize AI. It is an invocation to make intelligible, to critique and to seek to undo the logics and politics of race and coloniality that continue to be put to work in technologies and imaginaries associated with AI in ways that exclude, delimit, and degrade other ways of knowing and living and being that do not ascribe to the hegemony of Western reason. Decoloniality is located and it is specific. It is about the production of race and divided worlds. It is about power and how the precise effects of power work on being in the world today. It is about knowledge and how knowledge is ascribed legitimacy and value. And it is about the politics of resistance that enters and undoes the object of its critique. And this includes, as I've outlined here in relation to ethics in particular, the discourses that rationalize and obscure the history and effects of AI. There are as well many other ways in which decoloniality must be brought to bear on the field and practice of AI besides those explored here. However, in drawing on the discourse of decoloniality, Critics of AI must resist the sublimation of decoloniality as another rationality that justifies and legitimizes AI ultimately. To do so reperforms the very abstractions and disembodiment of thought that decoloniality seeks to resist. So to be clear, if the decree to decolonize AI is not addressing race and historically embedded forms of Occidental power over, nor seeking to rupture the precise epistemological and teleological assumptions of the discipline and related fields from within a historical reading of their formation and appropriation within colonial regimes, then decolonization is being misappropriated as a metaphor, and its usage in the discourse of AI has to become part of that to which decoloniality proper must address its critique. And this becomes even more critical where surveillance AI technologies are being used to thwart other decolonial resistances to racism and neo-imperial power. So it does not go far enough to restate that AI is having a racializing effect, or that its ubiquitous power throughout the world is hegemonic and neo-imperialistic. If through AI, colonial modes of power over and dividing practices of racism are becoming reinstituted behind the veil of technocracy, what is the precise form of this reinstitution of race and colonialism? How can AI be located within the long durée of colonialism and race? So through examining the critical histories of the assumptions upon which the field of AI is based, and the knowledge practices in which it engages, a new understanding of the effects of its power can emerge, which can too create the space for other localized and culturally diverse ways of understanding and doing AI. However, these critical histories, as briefly set out above, also point to another consternation, that rather than reproducing the logics of race and reaffirming the legacies of coloniality, AI depends on them. So we can recall what Edward Said said about the dividing line between the Occidental and the Oriental worlds was paradoxically presupposed and depended on by the West. As such, the task of decolonizing AI requires, as I've begun to do so here, a critique of the ways in which AI is made possible by and depends upon colonial forms of power and the dividing practices of racialization. But Said also intimates at another meaning that the presupposition and dependence of Western power on racialization and colonialism is paradoxical, that it leads to an impasse from which Western reason has no answer. So within AI, these aporias can be glimpsed in the industry's dogmatic pursuit to stimulate intelligence, which latently affirms that intelligence is not hereditary but environmental, or in the industry's manipulation of behavior, attention, and thought, which indicates the breakdown of the autonomous Cartesian self, which paradoxically ideas around intelligence and automation in AI is modeled on. For post-colonial thinkers, it is precisely in these impassive moments where the Western equation of thought becomes unbalanced, that a politics of speaking from the South can regenerate as productive and life-affirming, articulating the otherwises and the elsewheres of a humanity, as Amy Césaire wrote, made to the measure of the world. Ralph, I'll leave it there because I think we're running out on time and I don't want to speak forever, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was great. And to those of you who joined us partway through the presentation, welcome. You were listening to Rachel Adams, who's a senior research specialist at the Human Sciences Research Council in South Africa. And Rachel was talking about the topic of can artificial intelligence be decolonized? And you are in the Attire seminar series. This is number 3, presented by HUMA, the Institute for Humanities in Africa. So at this point in the seminar, we have about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So if anybody would like to ask a question, you could use the reactions panel at the bottom, the sort of emojis that include a raised hand, if you like. And then I can see a whole view of everyone here. If you put your hand up, your graphic hand, then I'll know that you want to ask something. And let's see. I mean, I was really interested, Rachel, in your story of the Zimbabwean archive of photographs that was used by a Chinese company to train their facial recognition systems on. And it actually reminded me of something from the 1960s in South Africa, which is Polaroid cooperated with the South African apartheid government to develop a camera called the ID2 that was good at photographing black faces, because film stock like AI also had a bias in the technology that it was designed to reflect a range of skin tone that was for Caucasian skin. And so it didn't, so most film stock didn't photograph black skin well. And so that was a motivation for the apartheid government that was producing the infamous passes for people that people had to carry like a passport to move around South Africa if they were black. That was motivation for them to develop a way of photographing black faces more clearly. So I thought it was interesting in both cases, the cost of inclusion. So when we talk about bias and the damaging effects of bias, we can also think about the costs of inclusion. You know, the more people that are included in those systems, the more they're also subject to control. So yeah, that's a sort of a connection I wanted to make. And there's a great artwork made in 2013 by Oliver Chinaran and Adam Broomberg, South African photographers, which they made an artwork about that. So questions are in the chat. Let's see. So Syed Mustafa Ali says, it is not clear to me whether Rachel has provided an answer to her question, and I've read her paper closely. Yes. I'm tempted to say something about the sort of academic mode around, you know, posing questions versus answering questions, but I'll hand it back to Rachel. Can you read the chat window as well, Rachel?
Yeah, and I've been engaging with Mustafa about this briefly. I think in some ways, the question of the title of this seminar and of the paper is a heuristic. It's supposed to be provocative. It's supposed to ask those who are engaging readily and too easily in this discourse of decolonizing AI, whether AI can even be decolonized. I want to simply have that question in the kind of discourse. It's not there at the moment. In terms of whether it kind of can be, you know, I find the question itself too instrumental in its practical terms. We need a much broader, deeper, complex, more nuanced understanding of colonialism and colonialism's effects, and how this relates to the history of AI and the way in which AI is being used in the world today. So how can AI be decolonized is too easy a question. It asks for too easy an answer. So in that sense, no, I don't answer the question because I think it's too easy a question to ask, and it was provocative in such a time. And the other thing I wanted to kind of note, and I do so at the end of the paper, is that the question is being asked within this kind of space of imagining a decolonial future. And we have these kind of two visions of the future. One is this future of an AI-driven technological world, and the other is the future that decolonial thought necessarily imagines, which is the undoing of the effects of colonialism. And whether the two can exist together is, I think, part of the question. And I think we need to embrace another kind of question, which is, can we imagine a future that is not dominated by AI, or where AI does not play a kind of hugely crafting hegemonic role? And that does not seem to be in much current conversation at all about the future of AI. Not that it could be diminishing, but only that it could be expanding and getting bigger.
Thank you, Rachel, for that answer. And it sounds like this is part of an ongoing discussion that you've had with Syed. So I see Syed has also got more sort of responses in the chat window. But I'm going to first just check. Amina, did you have your hand up? Did you want to ask a question?
I did. Thank you so much, Rachel, Dr. Rachel, for making these connections of authors that I very much love and that I have been engaging with for the past 2 years. And I think my question was very much related to what Sayyid Mustafa Ali has asked in terms of where, or beyond academia or away from academia, where can we actually start decolonizing AI in terms of practical terms to start with the noise in the background.
So, you know, I think there's some very interesting work being done on the other side of a critique of AI in terms of building indigenous AI systems. And I don't know enough about it. I know there's work going on in Ethiopia, and there's been a fair amount of documentation on the work that's being done in places like Canada and in Hawaii around indigenous AI that's incorporating local value systems and being used to assist, let's not use the word solve, but to assist and respond to local needs. So I think for me, I'm interested in understanding more about what's happening in these places and how the kind of technology of AI is being subverted. What is it about AI beyond the technology, or is it the ideology? Like, where are the kind of colonial impulses coming from? And how are these kind of layered together? And I think exploring how these kind of indigenous AI groups that are calling themselves that and using that terminology are working would be a helpful place to start.
Great, thank you, Rachel. I'm just going to ask, so I see questions that are written in the chat, and I think it would be great to hear people's voices and to hear them, you know, hear their voices. So I'm going to ask Phila to unmute, and Phila, if you could ask your question. You'll have to do your unmute button, Phila.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Hi, Rachel. Thank you for an interesting talk. My question was about there's two bits to my question. One is whether or not AI, the case that's being made here is that AI is inherently colonial. But in part of what you were saying in answering a different question, it seems as if AI is not inherently colonial after all, if there are these indigenous AI groups that you were speaking about in Ethiopia and in other places on the continent. And basically my question was more about, is the problem with AI here, the way in which it's being developed, the way in which, say, training data is being sourced unethically, is the problem privacy and those kinds of issues? Or are you saying there's something inherently wrong with the technology itself?
Thanks, Pilar. I think we need to know much more. We need to have a much deeper exploration of the kind of coloniality and the logics of race that are involved in AI. I don't know enough about how these indigenous groups are using the technology and what the relationship is between their kind of local value systems and the technology, and how it kind of differs from the way in which AI technologies are being used across the world. So I can't answer that question thoroughly enough. There is a question that I think goes back to what Ralph was saying at the beginning about these artificial moral intelligences. There's a question about whether technology is neutral, and all of social technical studies has been saying, well, technology is not neutral. Technology is the product of particular people with particular value systems, and it affects the world in which it is put to work, and it is affected by the world in which it is put to work. And then you have the kind of rise of this good AI, benevolent AI, and critics who are saying, well, AI is a technology, it can never be good or moral or benevolent. So there's a kind of question going on there in terms of what are the kind of values, what are the kind of social values that an AI can exhibit. If it can exhibit bias, then can it also exhibit kind of positive social values like morality? And it's not something that I've explored enough, but I'm certainly interested to do so. And I think, Pilar, part of your question comes to this kind of exploration. Ralph, I see Azza has a hand as well.
Yes, I was going to go first, Richard Higgs, and then Azza.
Great, thank you. Rachel, fantastic. I've been looking to hear something like this for a while. So I loved what you had to say, everything. My question is, here in Africa, we tend to have this, this attitude that the West has to dictate to us what we need to do with technology, and there's this kind of fetishization of AI that we inherit from the West from their fetishization, and we kind of just take it on, and by extension 4IR, and our government is kind of pushing 4IR and pushing it into schools, etc., etc. And I find that very disturbing. And my question is to you is if you're aware if there's an appetite for addressing a decolonial approach to AI and IT by governments or political parties in South Africa. And I'm not just talking about, for example, where the NRF, for example, is looking at capturing indigenous knowledge and looking at indigenous knowledge systems, which is only looking at the content. It's not looking at any kind of biases inherent in the technology. So my question to you is, are you aware from your perspective in the HSRC of any appetite to kind of take this further in a formal political sphere? Thanks.
Yeah, this is, Richard, I think we might have just lost you from the connection, unless that's on my side, but that's a great question. For me, that kind of fetishization of the 4IR and AI is almost heightened here. It's heightened because there's this sense of AI is going to solve all our problems, and AI is going to advance us from being a developing state to a developed state. So in some ways, it's even more of a kind of golden bullet than it is in the West. And I agree that I think we can generally talk about outside of Africa, voices and forms of power that are dominating the space within this region in diverse and different ways. So it's not just the West, but it's China too. So China has played a very critical role in influencing government to purchase particular technological infrastructure and this, that, and the other. And in terms of government's appetite, it's such a political question because of all the advantages that AI is thought to bring to particularly the South African economy. It is a really fraught political question. And in certain pockets, I know within Department of Science and Innovation, for example, there's real interest in understanding what are the particular kind of African dimensions to AI. What does AI mean here? And how can we foreground African understandings and needs of AI as we develop policy responses to it? But in other pockets of government, there's other political motives at play that dampen that kind of much more open-ended attitude to exploring an AI or policies to AI that would be more locally relevant. And then decoloniality, if that was used as the sign under which this kind of policy work took place, again, that's a kind of political question. And politics doesn't like to see itself as political many times. So in order to do this kind of change, to enact this kind of change, ultimately might well require, and I've seen it in my own work, not talking about it in such heightened terms as decoloniality, but talking more about utilizing existing legal, regulatory and ethical standards rather than simply taking those that exist in the West and superimposing them on here. So Richard, I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you, Rachel.
Interesting.
And thanks,
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks, Richard, for your question. Just as a last question and answer, let's have Azza from Humor.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for the great talk. I think what I really liked about your presentation is that you pointed to the complexity of decolonialization of knowledge, and I think it also leads us to talk about actually the complexity of colonialism, because it's not just that kind of simple hegemonic relationship between North and the South, but there is a lot of layers about colonialism. Colonialism produced a lot of inequalities. If we look at language, if we look at gender, if we look at economy, I mean, there's a lot of layers of what the colonialism project is all about. And I really like this kind of intersectionality you introduced. I mean, like, for example, when I did my PhD, like my PhD defense, because it was the time of Corona, so I had to speak to a machine, like I had to speak to cameras that project on you. It moves according to voices, so it's like some sort of smart technology. And what was interesting is that when women in the room were talking, the camera doesn't move as fast as it moves to men, And this shows you how it was that kind of knowledge that was fed to make this kind of cameras are actually also gender biased, And I had to actually shout for 2 hours in my defense, like until my vocal cords were really hurt. So this is how it is, and it's really for me it starts by participation. Like, I mean, addressing this complexity, addressing the intersectionality of the complexity of colonialism and participation. And yeah, this could be the beginning. Like, I mean, it's more of a comment than a question, but I would like to hear your reflections on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Azza.
Thank you so much. I completely agree. I think we do not even know enough about how colonialism continues to shape our lives today. We still need to do much, much more work to understand that. And certainly from my side, the question of gender is key here and needs to be foregrounded much, much more. Racialism is always gendered too. And I'm going to be working on a book based on this article that I presented on today, and the questions of gender will be much, much more closely foregrounded. And I just wanted to mention one writer who I found particularly incredible in this space. Zakia Iman Jackson has written an incredible book called Becoming Human that's just come out. And it doesn't, I mean, as far as I've read, it doesn't engage particularly closely with some of these questions of technology, but it engages with the relationship between gender and race in really startling and original ways. So Azza, maybe you would be interested in that, but I've certainly found it an incredible book. Thanks, Ralph.
Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks to everyone for their questions and for being here for Rachel's presentation. Thanks to Humor. We're going to wrap things up. We are back here at the same time next week for the 4th Attire seminar, and in fact, I will be the speaker next week, and I'm going to be talking about my project Spacecraft in terms of futures studies, and there's also a strand of futures studies which talks about the need to decolonize the future. So there will be some overlap there. Richard, I see you're raising your hand. We are closing up, but is there something you want to?
Very briefly, I just wanted to ask if Rachel could repeat the name of the author of Becoming Human, please.
I'm going to put the name in the chat here. It's Zakia Iman Jackson. Yeah.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks, Rachel. Zakia Iman Jackson, Becoming Human. Great. Thanks, everyone, and see you next week. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you. Bye.